Great Group Education Fund is dedicated to educating the public and professionals in our business with fact-based information featuring the experts in our profession, so that we might all do a better job of helping college athletes realize the promise of an educational degree and becoming all they can be as students and athletes. So we welcome you to our 51st webinar. Thank you to all of our panelists for their time, expertise, and ideas, and to all of you for attending. Webinars provide us with the opportunity to share new ideas, recalibrate our thinking on issues, and get up to date on important topics. We're so pleased to have you join us. Lastly, before you meet our moderator and panelists, I just want to emphasize that our speakers are expressing their own opinions and not the opinions of the organizations in which they are employed or are members, unless they make that distinction in their remarks. Now, I'm honored to introduce the moderator of today's program. Please meet Erica L. Ayala, a writer and on-air analyst for CBS Sports with over 10 years of experience in sports media. Erica's work has been published in the New York Times, Forbes, Sports Illustrated, among other media. It's all yours, Erica.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, everyone, including, of course, our panelists for joining us this morning. Early morning for some, but I'm excited to be here. Again, when you registered, you also received the biographies of our panelists. So I'm not going to do too much there, but we'll give you a brief introduction of the panelists and ask them a very important question here. So we're going to start with Shirin Malkani, who is the co-chair of Perkins Coles Sports Industry Group. Joined that firm almost 20 years ago in-house on both legal and business side of the media business, including 7 years with the NBA. And Shirin, the question of the day, you get to start and kick us off. But what is your favorite trend or news topic in women's sports right now?
I've actually been really interested in female athletes as investors. And I think we're seeing this not just in the professional space, but the college space too. And to me, that's really important in terms of creating pipelines and new platforms and opportunities for female athletes more broadly. These women understand the challenges they face and sort of how they can best amplify, the voices as well as the exceptional play for female athletes. So I really like that as a trend and a news story.
I love it. As one of my good friends, Kelsey Trainer, would say, invest, hire, and pay women in sports. I love that. Okay, we're going to move on to Ed Desser, the president of Desser Sports Media, was the senior media executive in the NBA Commissioner's Office for 23 years, launching NBA.com, NBA TV, League Pass, and the WNBA. Ed, same question to you. What's your favorite news topic or trend in women's sports?
Thanks, Erica. I'm going to be kind of flippant in my answer. I would say the trend that I see ongoing is in women's sports is not necessarily the focus on the word women's. I think that we're seeing a time when it's all just sports. And to me, that's a significant milestone and one that I'd salute.
Ooh, I like that. And we're definitely going to hop into that a little bit more. Ed, thank you so much. Pam Seidman is up next, founded Accelerate Equity to advance gender equity in high school and college sports. The organization launched the Gender Equity Dashboard, the first resource making it easy to see how every college is doing at providing equal opportunity in women's sports. Pam, welcome and thank you for joining us. And what's your favorite topic or trend in women's sports right now?
Thank you very much, Erica. I think that as women's sports has begun to get more coverage, more media, we're seeing that it's not all sort of positive and candy coated. We've reached a state where it's appropriate, and we're seeing where there are criticisms, where players are called out if there is bad behavior. And I think that is sort of a stage growth and normalization of women's sports as it grows.
I love that, especially coming off of what Ed said. I think that's two interesting takes that I'd love to circle back to. So thank you, Pam, for that. And Carol Stiff is here with us. She is the president of the Women's Sports Network, responsible for strategic direction, overseeing content development, and managing relationships with leagues and athletes. She's also a Hall of Famer. Carol Stiff, I mean, we could be here all day talking about what you've been able to do in women's sports and continue to do. But I want to ask you the first question, which is, what's your favorite trend or news trend or topic in women's sports right now?
Well, first of all, thank you, Erica, and I applaud the Drake Group for having this open conversation today. And I hope we get a lot of great questions. I kind of agree with everyone that comments that it's kind of fun to go last. Unfortunately, Ed, there's plenty of room for women's sports other than
I
the
knew you were
majors.
going to take a shot at that. That's okay.
So, but honestly, I remember being at ESPN and the great George Bodenheimer asking us many, many years ago, should we launch a women's sports network? And I disagreed with them. Absolutely disagreed. Absolutely disagreed. I wanted women's sports to be part of the main menu. I didn't want to be the dessert. I didn't want to be the appetizer, and I didn't believe in it. So we need to be next to the men's sports that are getting and delivering on great ratings and advertising. So, but unfortunately, I pivoted from ESPN, and I noticed that we do need a women's sports network because there's so many more explosion of rights that can be shared on a fast channel, which is the Women's Sports Network, which is, by the way, my first commercial, 24/7, no subscription. And like I look at the rugby league, I look at the PPL, I look at all these professional leagues that are expanding, which is just an extension of what we have in the college game. So explosion is real. I'd love to see more advertisers come to the table. It'll be interesting to hear how we go down that avenue today or that pike. And what's really concerning is the settlement. And will Title IX prevail in the world that we live in right now? And I'm concerned. I want to make sure we have opportunities for our men and women to compete at the college ranks and not be level set to a lower standard than what the football and men's basketball is getting. So let's keep an eye on that.
All right. You see why I had Carol go last? Because I knew we were gonna get a lot there, and we will definitely tease out a lot of things. But I actually forgot to say one of my favorite things in news and trends, and the Women's Pro Baseball League is gonna have its draft today. And as someone who played baseball and was effectively forced into softball, I'm very eager to see this iteration of pro baseball for women. So excited to see who goes first overall. I know a lot of people will be keeping eyes to see where Monet Davis lands of all people. But Carol and Shirin, I want to come to you because I want to start first with perhaps this explosion. And Ed and Pam are going to help us dissect where that came from a little bit coming up. But a lot of people are talking about the trends, whether we're thinking about the WNBA being able to capitalize from what we saw from Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark in the NCAA. You think of new up and coming leagues. I just mentioned the WPBL. We've seen Athletes Unlimited. We have seen Unrivaled, etc. So many different things, Shirin, that are seemingly using innovative models when it comes to being able to provide women's sports for fans, but then also tapping into new sponsors. So Shirin, I'll start with you. What are the trends that we're seeing? What is this boom that everyone keeps talking about in women's sports? And how, if at all, is it related to how the sports are being marketed and distributed via broadcast?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm really interested to hear what other folks on the panel think about this too. Because for me, it's always a bit of a chicken and egg, right? Like, I don't know where you can sort of point to the origin. I think it's a bit of a seesaw, and I think in many ways, like we saw in COVID, where athletes in general were, taking such a lead in speaking about COVID and the public health of it, and I think it was a real moment for the W, right? Like we saw that, and I think it coalesced to too with Black Lives Matter. And, I think a lot of the female athletes have used their platforms in ways to really amplify their voices. And so I think you couple that with finally a broad-based acknowledgement of the women as athletes, as deliverers of excellent content, right? Like I think for many years there was this thought that watching a women's game was less compelling, was less interesting. And so I think you were starting to see all these kind of trends come together with women being platformed, women athletes being platformed, having a voice on on cultural and political and important issues broadly. And you couple that with their acknowledgement as the players themselves. And I think then that creates the flywheel for the money, right? Which at the end of the day, if we can't get to equality on the money, we're never going to get to equality in any of the other metrics either. So then you start to see more sponsors coming in. And, Ed will tell you, he was at the NBA before I was at the NBA after, so many of the deals that were done, whether it was sponsorship or media rights, it was the W being bundled in, right? And so we start to see really sponsors and broadcasters coming in and platforming women's sports independently. And I think that's a lot of, what we're going to talk about here, particularly around media rights too. And I know Ed will do a good job of setting the table there, but thinking about how we allow the women's leagues and the women's athletes to exist independently of the men, to value them, to bring the money in. And, unfortunately, you need sort of certain hallmarks for people to take you seriously, whether it's a media deal. I was actually on a panel a couple of weeks ago with John Patricoff of Athletes Unlimited, and I thought it was interesting. He said you need a betting deal to feel like you're actually playing in the big league. So I think there are different metrics, but across the board, we're seeing all of those metrics rise in women's sports, right?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for that. And Carol, I wanted to bring you in on this because I know that you have been a part of trying to broker some of that when you were with ESPN. A lot of people will point to the UConn-Tennessee rivalry and that being a way to create some of that attention without, as Shirin just mentioned, perhaps the opportunity for, I love the term excellent content, which now athletes can do on their own, much more than perhaps in the days where you were trying to get UConn and Tennessee on the air. So first tell us about that time and that era of trying to get women's sports, in this case, women's college basketball prime time, and what have you seen evolve to now what you're doing with, of course, the Women's Sports Network?
Wow, that could take all day. Well, the UConn-Tennessee game went to air in 1995, so that's quite a while ago. And it was a special day. It was Martin Luther King Day. And at the time, I was given the opportunity to program all our women's college basketball, everything that we owned. And at the time, we didn't have the women's basketball tournament. We only had the regional finals, which were 4 games, by the way, 4 games on ESPN and the selection show. And then CBS had the national semifinals, 2, and then the championship. So guys, look where we've gone. Only 7 games from the women's tournament were airing in 1995. So fast forward go backwards to the UConn-Tennessee game. Well, that allowed me to have a game on ESPN because all my games were Sunday afternoon on ESPN2 up against, name it, NBA, NFL, Tiger Woods, NASCAR, everything and anything. So the chances of me getting a highlight on SportsCenter after all of those highlights had to air was nil. So that's been a change over the years. Fast forward now, the national championship game for the women's basketball tournament is on ABC, broadcast TV, thanks to the push of the Kaplan report, which Ed can go through, and the NCAA working with ESPN. But that allowed me to put a special game together. It was a 1 versus 2 game, by the way. The AP poll was held. It was at Gamble Pavilion. It was sold out. The New York Times, Erica, was in the building for the first time. And you could just feel the electricity. And it was obviously in January. And Pat Summitt, to her credit, stepped outside her SEC conference, flew all the way up to Storrs, Connecticut, and played UConn, who, as we know, was undefeated and went on to be undefeated and win the national championship in '95. So that was a huge game, being on ESPN, et cetera. Great rating by the way, for 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So that was a touch point. But let's look at that era. In 1996, ESPN took over the tournament. We did 25 games, so 7 to 25. The WNBA was working on a research project in 95, leading into the 96 Olympics in Atlanta. Should we launch a women's pro league? And so they did a tour of 8 games, 4 on ESPN, 4 on ESPN2, where Tara Vanderveer had to step away from her Stanford Cardinals to coach this USA national team. And the goal was obviously to win the gold in Atlanta, which they did. I just wonder what David Stern would have done if they didn't win the gold. I mean, the pressure on that team and the pressure on Tara Vanderveer was, like unbelievable. So Val Ackerman, obviously working at the league office and working with USA Basketball, then became the president of the WNBA. There's a lot of great flow of moments in time in 95, 96. And that set the stage for more games to be moved from Sunday to Big Monday after Diana Taurasi era. I went into my executives at ESPN and go, look at these numbers. Can I please have a prime time window instead of Sunday afternoon? I get Big Monday, so I took all my great games, but it was on ESPN2, still wasn't ESPN at the time, and up against Mike Krzyzewski and Dean Smith, men's basketball, ACC. So to me, it was a great time because it was Monday night, and maybe I could get some highlights on SportsCenter. And then fast forward to where ESPN is now, and more people are getting involved. There's more prime time. There's more game day with State Farm going out to games. Now you have Turner involved. You have Fox doing women's basketball, and that's where the explosion is. And then, of course, what happened, because Sharon, you mentioned COVID, what happened in the bubble was amazing in so many different ways. To see what the men had and the women had, obviously, was disturbing, to say the least, and allowed the Kaplan report to be written with Ed's help. And some changes have come as a result. And then you go to the acquisition that I was not a part of this go around with ESPN and the NCAA, and you see some changes and I think there's some specials that are part of the not just women's basketball, but the 40 championships they're doing now. When I left, we were doing 21. So let's be careful here throwing too many darts at ESPN. But we can do more. So I'll leave it at that. I hope that answered a very, very long-winded answer to a very loaded question.
Fair, very loaded, and for a reason, because I want to be able to tease this out. Because, Pam, I'm going to come to you and Ed next here, but, we're seeing media rights deals increase for women's sports. NCAA, we've heard the WNBA be mentioned a few times. We could extend that to the NWSL, which is about to have its championship, etc. We're seeing that women athletes are able to make money, right, off of NIL. We're seeing that then translate NIL deals to deals that pro athletes can utilize, even Olympians can utilize to continue their playing career. So everything's great, right, Pam?
Thank you very much for that softball pitch. You transferred well from baseball to softball. I see it very much as a split screen right now, where there is so much good happening and growth and explosion. And at the same time, college sports are very much, and of women's college sports, being threatened by the settlement. The NCAA has.
And I'm sorry, Pam. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but I'd just like for you, because the settlement has been mentioned a few times, if you could just step back a little, just so we can set a barometer for everyone listening. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Erica. So the settlement is between a number of athletes represented by Grant House, who was a swimmer. That's the House part of it, against the NCAA. And the athletes basically wanted to be able to get some benefit from the revenue that is generated when they play sports. And the NCAA previously had said no. And so that case was settled. And so it's referred to as the NCAA House settlement. What the settlement does, it has both back damages. So athletes who played between 2016 and 2024 get some 2.8 billion. And then going forward, colleges are able to share revenue, and beginning this year, it's about 20.5 million per college. The back damages goes 90% to male athletes. 75% goes to football players, 15% to men's basketball players, 5% to women's basketball players, and then everyone else shares the other 5%. In terms of revenue sharing going forward, every college or university has the ability to distribute that money as they wish. However, many are simply following the formula that was set up for back damages. And so women are being impacted both on the damages side and then the revenue share going forward. And the justification for giving the men the 90%, people will say, well, those sports, they earned it. They made more revenue. But with all due respect to the athletes, the reason that some sports brought in more revenue didn't have to do so much with what the athletes did on the field. It had to do with the people negotiating the agreements. And if you go back 30 years to 1996, the NCAA does a deal with ESPN for women's sports and with CBS Turner for men's basketball. And they wind up getting 1/500th for women's basketball what they're paying for men's basketball, right? 1/5 of 1%. The entire ESPN deal, which covered a number of other sports, that was still just 1% of what they're paying for CBS, what they're getting from CBS Turner. And even if you then say, well, maybe that only 1/500th of, they were getting that small amount of viewership. But if you look at TV viewership, you see that it's very different than that. Viewership of the women's tournament averaged 18% of what the men got from 96 up until the pandemic, and then 59% from the pandemic going forward. But still, NCAA was accepting deals, doing new media agreements that continued to bring in less than 1% for the women of what they were getting for the men, until the most recent deal in 2025, where now they're getting a big 6%. So when people say that the men have brought in more revenue, it isn't so much what the athletes on the field did, right? The athletes are all putting in as much time as they're allowed to on their sports. They're all working as hard. It's competitive at the D1 level for talent. And so, what has influenced those deals has been, I think, a lack of imagination, that people wanted to watch women's sports. And so there was underinvestment, lack of promotion. And I'll talk later more about sort of marketing, lack of promotion. But that real disparity in revenue historically should not be a basis for determining how damages or revenue sharing go forward. It should be Title IX that applies.
Yes, and I definitely want to get into that, Pam. Thank you so much for breaking that down. And you probably have noted, everyone, that I've been taking notes because I hope to, again, have through lines here. And Ed, we heard Shirin talk about bundled marketing, or excuse me, media deals. And Pam also addressed that a little bit with this lack of imagination that those in charge have for then effectively setting the valuation in college, and that has extended to professional sports as well. So I want to use a quote from Dawn Staley to set you up here, Ed. She, in 2024, said that she felt that women's basketball was being held back intentionally. And then I want to flash back to 2021, where Sedona Prince, in a lot of ways, showed that through what we saw in the locker rooms at the single site kind of COVID NCAA tournament, where we saw a decked out weight room and a triangle pyramid of weights for all of the teams at the single site for women. How does what we saw um, really illuminated again via social media in 2021 and the disparities, how has that changed the conversation, including, of course, that 2021 gender equity report?
Well, I guess I would start with um, the Sedona Prince video is a flashpoint. And like so many things, you never know exactly what is going to light the fire, but that clearly did, and it went viral, and it embarrassed the NCAA, and they commissioned the report, and to their credit, they said, we want answers to what you independently observe and recommendations. And they didn't interfere. They gave us the data. We did the study, and the media report, which was part of the Kaplan report, was 100 and some odd pages, um, with lots of recommendations, and a number of those have been adopted, and several have not. Um, I think it's useful in the context of this subject to take at least a couple of steps back and recognize that there are a lot of different things going on all at the same time here. So you have, on the one hand, this sort of, I'll call it a disintegration of traditional media. It hasn't completely disintegrated, but relative to the days that Carol was speaking about of the halcyon days of ESPN, um, linear television just isn't what it used to be today. So that is hurting the revenue side and the exposure side available from linear television. Now, the flip side is, as I think everyone knows, streaming has stepped in to both do two things, really. One, to accelerate the decline of linear media on the one hand, but also to provide many new um, opportunities for worthwhile programming to get visibility and revenue. So, you've got these sort of tectonic forces that are buffeting the industry, and then enter the change in women's sports and the perspective of women's sports. Now, Carol will tell you that, so maybe surprisingly to many, um, the the viewership demographics of women's sports is not all that different from the viewership and demographics of men's sports. If you're a sports fan, you're a sports fan. And I take that as good news, because it's a recognition of really where I started out, which is it's about women's sports being considered sports, not some sort of subsection or lesser or what have you. Now, the Caitlin Clark effect is real, and it has galvanized interest in a way that no individual could have really manufactured. I mean, this is one of those flash in the pan, sort of like the Sedona Prince video. Um, she's very talented. She's unassuming. She can make, threes with her eyes closed practically. Um, she's a gifted athlete, and that has allowed both the NCAA and the WNBA to transcend kind of where they were and go up a notch or more. And so all of the confluence of all of these things is impacting the industry, and it's sort of pushes and pulls and struggles. I will say, and for the future of women's sports, I think it's terrific that the WNBA got 6 times the rights fees that they had previously. And partially that has to do with being packaged with the NBA. Um, and in fact, the previous deal probably did as well. So, let's not kid ourselves. In today's world, um, the the rich are getting richer. The NFL, college football, the NBA, they are all seeing significant growths in media rights. And at the same time, that is putting a squeeze on others. And I'm seeing it even today in negotiating new deals. Um, if you're not a tier one property, you're not seeing even what was being proposed, just a few years ago being available. So the cash has to come from somewhere, and it's coming from everything that isn't one of those, top end properties. And and that's unfortunate in large measure because I think, and we've seen this in the WNBA of late. There's this perception amongst the athletes in the WNBA that we're second class citizens and we're not getting paid what we're worth. Um, and I understand everyone wants to get paid more than they're getting paid today, and that's kind of human nature. Um, the business has not developed to a point as of yet, despite 28 years of the NBA being a backstop. Um, it hasn't yet evolved to a point where it can really compete with the generation of revenue for the men. And and I appreciate them wanting it, and I appreciate them feeling that it's unfair. Um, but it's maybe no different than teachers who are underpaid. You can think of any number of professions that are more about feeling the doing it for the cause as opposed to necessarily for the money. And we have that here in the WNBA. One other comment, and I'll get off my soapbox, but uh, I've personally feel like the coming labor dispute is tragic, and I don't believe the WNBA has handled it particularly well, and I don't think the players have taken the time and done the work to really understand the business. I mean, if what you're going to complain about is, well, the men get 50% of the revenue and we get 7 or whatever the number was. Um, that's a nice soundbite, but it doesn't really get to the core of the issue, which is, you want to have chartered aircraft travel. It costs every bit as much to charter the women's team as it does to charter the men's team. And and those are real expenses on a smaller base, which means it's more expensive on a relative basis, on a percentage basis to do that, to open the arena. I mean, there are any number of things we can talk about, but I think that's the situation we're looking at. I very much hope that we don't see a stoppage in the WNBA, but I'm fearful that we will. It's more likely than not.
Yeah, and I think you brought up some really interesting points here. I do want to just offer some context for the WNBA. That is a league that I cover, and uh, just for the sake of clarification, WNBA players get, I don't know, roughly anywhere from 4 to 6% of revenue from their league, whereas that is already at 50% of basketball, operational costs, or I should say income. So that's, I would say that's a pretty significant gap there. I think also what we're seeing is, and Sharon, I actually am going to come to you on this. I think that as we're seeing media continue to evolve, as you said, there is the the, the disintegration, I believe is the term that you used, of traditional media, but that's also opened up for social media. And women tend to fare pretty well when it comes to connecting with an audience because of decades of having to do that, to have visibility for their league. And yet still, when we see some of those things, some of the great equalizers that have existed in the 30 years almost of the WNBA, and of other women's leagues, where we should be seeing some equity, this is certainly my take, we're not. And so I wonder where that comes from. Pam, I think you would be great to chime in on this as well, but I want to come to Shirin first, because something that we've been hearing is bundling. I know you've talked about it. It's been mentioned a few times with regard to broadcast deals. And there is still this coupling of women's sports with men's sports. And I think some women's sports, we've been talking a lot about basketball, so I'll just stay on that trend. The NBA All-Star Weekend, one of the most recent, most successful NBA All-Star weekends, included WNBA player Sabrina Ionescu. And so the NBA was able to benefit directly from having Sabrina at its All-Star, but we don't see that reciprocity, even though those two organizations and entities are part of NBA enterprises. I wonder, Shirin, as we continue to see, again, this innovation coming on the broadcast side because of digital, because of social, are there ways that women can raise their stake and their equity? What are some of the limitations that we're seeing to that?
Yeah, and it was funny. I was thinking while Ed was talking, and you sort of alluded to it, Erica, is there's like a mediated experience and a disintermediated experience. And I think about, what we think of as traditional kind of linear television, pay TV, over the air broadcast. That's a very intermediated experience. And this goes back to what Pam was saying too about who is doing these deals, right? Whether they're bundling them, how they're allocating those values. But whoever is making a deal is essentially attaching value, right? For better or for worse. And I think what's interesting to me is the disintermediated piece. And I think that's the social side of it. And whether you think of it from the perspective of YouTube and putting just live streams of games on that platform and allowing, fans to find it. And I think with AI, you see much better production value that people are capable of doing with a lot less infrastructure than you could do, even 5 or 10 years ago, where you had to have a truck pulled up outside. Now you can have your talent remote. You can get a really good graphics package. You can get, real-time alternate language feeds, right? So there are all of these things that I think technologically in a platform like YouTube, and I should say I do a lot of work with them, so I'm a bit of a homer in terms of like YouTube, I think being a really powerful platform. But I like that because it's disintermediated, right? Like nobody's doing a deal to say you can put a live stream on YouTube. No one's doing a deal necessarily, although there's clearly a lot of influencer marketing going on, but for you to have a presence on TikTok or Instagram and build followers. And I think particularly for female athletes, it's become a really powerful way for them to prove their value outside of this kind of intermediated way of traditionally licensing content. And so what I hope it does through these, social platforms that are much more fan and athlete driven, that you can prove out a value that, to Pam's point, you couldn't prove in the old model, not because of the athletes, but because of the systemic issues there. So I really like these disintermediated experiences for fans and athletes, where you can do a better sense of getting the value attached to it that is commensurate with the value that the athlete's bringing.
And Pam,
Sharon makes a really good point
Oh.
about the disintermediated media flows, but I hasten to add, nobody's paying a rights fee to, at YouTube. They're providing a platform and anyone can get on, and that's great. And it's very democratic in the sense of, the number of streams you can generate. You don't depend on anyone else. So, but it's absolutely essential to think of social as part of this, because as much user time is going to social as linear television these days. It's stunning the amount of screen time.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, and I think that's a good point about license fees, but I work with emerging leagues, and one of them had to pay for airtime on the CBS Sports Network and just did a rev share on advertising. So if you think about YouTube, that's just a rev share on advertising. So in some ways, it's yes, they're sort of like the crown jewels, the NFLs, the NBAs, all the, the men's football, they are getting those rights fees. But even some folks who are on linear aren't necessarily getting those juicy rights fees, right? Because
Well,
particularly now,
and CBS is keeping their affiliate fees to
right.
themselves. So, they're not exactly magnanimous here.
No, by no means am I suggesting they are. But yeah, I think this whole erosion of these business models in general, where we have the haves and the have-nots, and I do think social is an opportunity to create maybe a third class there, right? And people who hopefully can move into the haves, right? It's a platform to push them to that side of the equation from a rights perspective.
Yeah, and Pam, I'd like to have you chime in here, and then Carol, I'll come back to you as well. But this idea of disintermediated and this idea of again emerging, I think has shown, right? We've seen in pockets that women's sports has seen their valuations in some ways attached to some of these things. And yet, when it comes to divvying out settlements, when it comes to broadcast rights deals that include NCAA or professional women, the percentage is not equal to the amount of traffic, viewership, attendance that some of these disintermediated social engagements have brought to the collective. And I think that's really when we talk about Title IX, when we talk about gender equity, that's what we're talking about here. And a lot of times women are told, well, you have to know the business, you have to know the numbers. And so just a few numbers in 2024, when Dawn Staley made that comment, I looked up some of the broadcast numbers, and Caitlin Clark, yes, was a part of, I believe it was at the time, 5 of the top 10 most watched NCAA games. Kim Mulkey was a part of 2 of them, one as a coach, one as a player. And then I believe the number was 4. 4 of those top 10 games, the player that was a part of that was Cheryl Miller, who's played decades before Caitlin Clark. And the numbers were on target. So when it's not just looking at disintermediated, it's not just looking at the percentages of revenue share at sub 10% versus upward of 50%. There are case studies, there is data that we have that is not being executed and implemented, at least from what I've been seeing, equitably. And Pam, when you are putting together the work that you do and you're making the case, what are the ways that you're trying to impart that we have data, we have numbers, we've had them in some cases for decades, but why are we seeing that those numbers presumably are not enough of a case for the success of women in sports and women's sports?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, it's really difficult to determine what the motive is behind, folks keeping things as they are. But generally, when people have power and money, they want to hold on to power and money, and they don't want to share power and money. And that's really sort of blunt and bald. But I think when you get to the bottom line, there is some of that. Recently, a Nobel Prize winning economist, Claudia Golden.
Yes, thank you in the New York Times. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, so she did an analysis looking at the salaries of WNBA players compared to the salaries of MNBA players, what they are, and based on viewership and attendance and what the economic value is, what they should be getting. And I believe that she said, right now they're getting paid, I forget if it's like 1%, 7%. It was less, it's clearly less than 10%, and it's probably closer to 1 or 2% of what the men are getting. But based on the economic value that players in the WNBA are creating, they should be getting somewhere around a fourth to a third of what the men are being paid. Why that doesn't happen? I think that change is tough. I think that it's the fact that the NBA owns so much of the WNBA. They own about 60%. And in some cases, that creates a conflict of interest. Some of those folks own both the WNBA team and an NBA team. Other parts of the ownership are the league. And over the years, yes, there has been a benefit to having the NBA there to support the W. But at the same time, there has been a lack of investment. There's been a lack of shoulder coverage. Games used to, you turn on the television, and if you could even find the game, it would just begin like that with the tip. There wouldn't be any introduction. There wouldn't be coverage. There wouldn't be the storytelling about the athletes that is essential for people to become fans. And there's been a lot of research recently on fans of women's sports and the fact that they are more dedicated to the brands that sponsor women's sports than are fans of men's sports. And so there's this kind of super value that a sponsor of women's sports gets that isn't being recognized or valued in. So when Ally Financial a few years ago said, we're going to devote 50% of our ad spend to men's sports, 50% to women's sports, that turned out to be great for them financially. That influenced their key performance indicators. And many people started banking with Ally Financial because they were so grateful that they were sponsoring women's sports. And they also, of course, offer a good product. So I think those are a number of factors. In college, women's basketball, when you look at the venue size that the finals are played in, the venue size for women averages, and this is going back 30 years, about 20,000. For men, for many years, it averaged about 40,000 or 47,000. And then in 2009, the NCAA started holding the Final Four for the men in much bigger stadiums. So now that averages, close to 80,000. It's well in the 70s. So why is the NCAA doing that? Why are the women's finals in these small venues? Is it that no one is showing up? No, they're selling out year after year, every single year. They're selling out. Why is the NCAA not wanting to get more ticket revenue, more exposure?
They are. They are actually in 2028. They're moving to a dome.
They're doing it in 2028. But why
We were in a dome before. We were in a dome many years ago under Bernadette McGlade's leadership as the chair of the committee, and it was a horrible experience. And now with the smaller venue, those tickets are harder to get. I don't know if you've been to a men's Final Four in those domes and you have the nosebleed, in the corner seat, not a great experience. So, we have tried these. We are moving. I really feel, Erica, that if you build it, they will come. And we're building it together. I look at the NWSL. They're not associated with any big brother like the WNBA. What are they paying their athletes? How are they keeping their infrastructure? They're on 5 different networks. They're hard to find too. And I'd also say that going back to the WNBA days when I programmed it at ESPN, we did pregame shows. We did that many years ago. We put mics on Cheryl Swoops before any of that was done in the men's side of the equation. Those pregame shows rated very poorly, which then the game had to play catch up to get a rating of viewership. So I really feel like we're in a pivotal time, call it the flash era of growing women's sports. And, just yesterday, I want to get this back to college a little bit. I was in Tampa and speaking to the women's lacrosse coaches at all divisions, 1, 2, 3, NAIA. The only division missing was high school, and they'll be invited next year. But they just put out a white paper, sort of like the Kaplan report. How can we grow women's lacrosse? And there were 5 pillars of how they're going to attack it. And that's exactly what they're going to do. And the number one issue that I heard in the room and in the white paper, maybe 2, was rule changes. No one watching lacrosse knows what the heck's going on, including some of the officials. So the officials, need some schooling too. And the other thing was TV, media rights for lacrosse. You never know if the game's going to be 2 hours and 20 minutes, 2 hours, but it's scheduled for 2 hours. So who wants to be behind that? So my point being to everyone and listening and everyone on this call is that and I'll say it again, if you build it, they will come. We're building it. It's coming. ESPN's NCAA deal has more than ever than it had before. They increased the dollar figure. But let's see what happens in 7 years. And I think the elephant in the room here, which we haven't discussed, is why ESPN did not take the women's basketball tournament out of the larger deal that they got, get the value of what it is. Maybe it's more games in the dome if Pam thinks that's a great idea, whatever. Maybe putting it at the same site where the men are, which Val Ackerman has been for. Let's try it once. Let's just try it once and see if it works. A lot of people hate that idea, a lot of fans and coaches, but let's just take a step back here that we're building it. And the CBA deal, I'll go back to the pros, is massive on how that's going to be announced without a lockout, Ed. So I just wanted to pump the brakes a little bit on the conversation, but I think that one about pulling out the rights for the tournament should be discussed because I know a lot of people outside my world talk about it.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring you into that because there were some people, we talked about Claudia. I think David Barry is another person I would highly recommend as someone who has these conversations. And some of what we have been hearing on the women's basketball side is that the players would love to be more informed if only they were given the information to do so. But what we're also seeing is that people outside of these leagues are doing these valuations. And so what is the fear? What is the fear, Carol, of separating women's sports and allowing it to stand for what it is on its own?
Another loaded question. I wasn't in the room, wasn't part of it. I do know that what ESPN's policy is in growing all these sports is to start with the crowning of the national championship. So the day that lacrosse team gets their trophy or women's basketball gets a trophy, and then building back. So as I stated early on, 7 games of the women's tournament was on in 1995. Let's look the following year, 25. Now all the games are on. So they added all these games. Softball, when I was there, we added super regionals. The men had super regionals. Why didn't the women have super regionals? We moved all the programming around to get super regionals in. And then the College World Series, the final was a best of 3. So they build back, and then they do, if you look at all the networks that ESPN has and launched, and including now, include Fox and NBC and all the others, they're all adding women's basketball. But what is it leading to? It's leading to the crowning of the championship. So to answer your question, I think that there was some hesitancy that maybe ESPN would pull back on their commitment to women's basketball if they didn't have it as part of their global NCAA rights deal. And if they had taken and given it to another media provider, that kind of devalued the money that was on the table for all the championships. But there's this thing that Ed knows is you can match if you're the incumbent. If someone puts $2 billion on the table, you have the right, and Shireen, you know this too, you have the right to match it before you lose it. But we never got to the number. What was it worth? And people speculate on that. But please do not forget that the whole growth of the thousands of games that they now produce and the game days that they take on the site and all the pre-games and all the social media that ESPN is doing has a direct result to the crowning of the champion. That's of value. So I hope that makes sense. I'll start. That's my opinion.
And Carol deserves credit. She's the person most responsible for every game of the women's basketball tournament being on an ESPN network. She blazed that trail prior to which I think were they regionalized? I'm trying to remember. It was just some games weren't on and others were regionalized, something like that.
That's another great point. Yes, we didn't have enough outlets. We didn't have enough channels to do all of 64 games or so. So we had to, we had to come up with technology that's now used for all sports, that the home market's got the game of their interest, their home team. And we did four of those at the same time. And then programming in my area decided if you don't have a home team in that window, who do you think the fan wants to watch? And then we would feed that. So we had 5 feeds coming in and out. And a lot of credit to ESPN for coming up with this regionalization technology that allowed people to see their home games and see national games all at the same time. And now they've outgrown it with technology that Sharon has mentioned, that now they placed all of their games across all networks. So you don't have to decide which game you want to watch, and you don't have to pay extra for it.
One other point, just as of clarification, we were talking about the bidding for the women's tournament, and that was another one of those things that was a recommendation in the Kaplan report. We proposed that they should not only sell the basketball tournament separately because it would generate far more interested bidders, but that they could couple together a series of other rights. You could take, for example, the softball and the baseball. There's any number of other permutations and combinations that could be designed to fit within the programming milieu of various other network parties. And we believe that there was substantially more value that could have been obtained that way. I think it was the NCAA that decided they didn't want to break the package apart. And once you make that decision, you've really limited yourself to essentially one entity that's in a position to make a significant bid, because nobody else has the fleet of networks. Certainly on the linear side, I mean, anybody can do it on a streaming basis, but I think the thinking has historically been that we want to emphasize linear television. And the NCAA is a very tradition bound enterprise. I'm trying to be gentle here. And that just informs their thinking. That plus they do things in a very, very long time horizon. So we pleaded for them to try and try out the idea of a single venue for Final Four. And it was sort of summarily dispensed with, even though they were in the process of choosing sites for the next 5 years. It was like, here's the perfect opportunity to do it.
Right.
No, we don't want to. And that's unfortunate, because I think actually, in fairness, there is a division within women's basketball as to which way they should go. And there are those who say, yes, bring on equity, and we think we can be additive to the men's tournament, and it makes sense to do it. And then there are those who think, well, we're just going to get secondary treatment. It's going to be, we'll get the leftovers. We're going to be staying in hotels 50 miles away from the stadium, et cetera, et cetera. And, those are legitimate arguments. But I think if you're going to look at what's in the best long-term interest of of creating more focus on college basketball, you will achieve that by putting two great events together in a world where we're more and more about the big event, the tent pole, the spectacle. I mean, the spectacle is the reason to do the tournament in a dome, not because it's better for watching basketball. It stinks for watching basketball. But you get it's a scene, it's a place to be, it's exciting in a different way. And that's the attraction. It's not, is this the best venue for basketball? I think that the best venue for basketball is a 12,000 seat arena that isn't built for hockey, so you've got tight end zones.
And you bring up something which is painfully obvious that has to be a part of the conversation.
That's my thing, is I do the
Yeah.
painfully obvious.
Well, I was going to say, similarly to your WNBA versus teachers reference, which as the daughter of a high school assistant principal, definitely hit hard. What we value versus what is valuable are not always the same. I mean, talk to first responders during COVID for that, which did include teachers. But again, perhaps that's a conversation for another panel. Pam, I wanted to come to you then, because the work that you do is surrounded by is about gender equity, excuse me. And what we're hearing is not just negatively impactful to the execution of Title IX, whatever that looks like these days, but also to men's sports and athletes that are not football and basketball. So what are we seeing the NCAA value, and how does that directly, I guess it seems diametrically opposed to some of the things that we have in place specifically for women to create equity. So how do we get out of that trap?
Yeah, I think it's a new trap that we're facing if the settlement isn't overturned, and I think it's highly unlikely that it would be overturned. And so, if a school is spending, say, 90% of their rev share on football and men's basketball, they're going to also then tilt operational expenses in those directions because that's where they're already putting money. So I think that, yes, men's Olympic sports and women's sports are likely to be squeezed. We're likely to see some of those sports either dropped or demoted to sort of a lower level where they would just play regionally. And that would be a tremendous loss for thousands of athletes. When we look at how value and money drive what's valuable, one way that has happened in men's basketball is that for many years, participants in the men's March Madness, every time that a team won a game, they earned a unit. And on the men's side now, those units are upwards of $2 million. And that money goes to the conference that the school is a part of. And so if you get all the way through the tournament, you're bringing quite a bit of money to your conference. Last year, the SEC brought in 70 million from these units. The year before that, the ACC brought in 34 million. So until last year, there were no units for women, none. And so here again, if a conference, and then the conference distributes that money in one way or another to the colleges, if you have the potential to have all that revenue coming in, you're going to want to invest in ways to help you get that revenue. So whenever we're providing extra carrots, that can be won by supporting men's sports. Women's sports and men's Olympic sports are going to suffer. For the first time last year, there were the beginning of units for women's basketball, but the unit was worth 113,000 on the women's side compared to 2 million on the men's side. And the NCAA justified that by saying, well, we're taking a certain percentage of the media rights contract. So again, the fact that these media rights contracts are so disparate is coming back and just biting the women in another way. Mm-hmm. And there's an alternative, and this is what happened with U.S. soccer. So, for a number of years, the U.S. women's national team was fighting for pay equity because they were doing so much better than the men's team, and they were getting paid so much less. And they wanted to be paid equally. And so eventually there was a settlement. And what US Soccer did is to say, well, we're getting a lot more money when the men play in the World Cup than we get when the women play. but we're going to take that money from FIFA that we get when the men play and the money that we get when the women play. We're going to combine it and we're going to share it out equally. Now, the NCAA could do the same thing. They could say money coming from the men's media contracts and money from the women's media contracts. We're going to bundle that and we're going to make the units of the same value. If they really wanted, if the NCAA wanted to lead on really pushing and advancing gender equity, they could. I don't expect that to happen. I wish I did, but unfortunately I don't.
And Sharon, I want to come to you here because I think that's the sentiment what Pam just said that a lot of people have, and quite honestly, there is evidence to support that. And Pam, you mentioned something earlier, which I think was a nod to Sports Innovation Lab and the work of Angela Ruggiero. That's how Allied Bank has come to, for those who know, wanting to get to equitable disbursements when it comes to women's and men's sports. But that has also led to programming on places like ESPN that they increase their package because of these direct investments, Sharon. Is that viable? Is that tenable moving forward? I mean, how much can those types of agreements and deals and sponsors who come to the table with that idea, is that enough to significantly move the needle as we continue to see women's college and pro sports on the rise?
Yeah, I think Pam said something earlier about sort of the difficulty of change, right? So part of the way I think about it are sort of the legacy players and the legacy institutions. So, what like Pam is describing and why she maybe is a little, sanguine about whether or not the NCAA might try and do that kind of revenue pooling. And I think it's an excellent idea, but agree that it may be a long time coming, if at all. So what I think about too are some of the emerging leagues, and I mentioned this before, but I think we're finding a lot more with startup leagues. If there are opportunities to have men and women participating in the sport, that there's pay equity, right? Whether it's something as simple as like the E1 boat racing league, which is an electric boat racing league, where they require both men and women to be part of the in-boat crews and they pay them equally. Or, the World Surf League, where they have this equal purses for men and women. So I think, and actually, again, John Patricoff, Athletes Unlimited, they were very intentional about giving their athletes equity in the league, right? So I think it's interesting to me to think about like equitable pools of revenue, resources, prize money, however you want to value it, and think about a lot of these newer and emerging leagues who I hope are pushing the legacy players to think more about equity, right? And particularly for something, like Athletes Unlimited, where they're providing opportunities for professional athletes for a lot of women's sports that didn't traditionally have as many professional outlets, right? And certainly we're seeing like a huge rise in women's volleyball professionally, which obviously, is coming from the excellent play in the colleges. So I feel like there are a lot of opportunities here to rebuild systems with these emerging leagues, right? And then ideally what you're going to do is push everyone in that direction, right? Because you will no longer be able to sustain these old models because the newer ones will proliferate that have more equity built into them. So to me, it's sort of like a 1-2 punch, right? Like if you just are going to focus on the legacy players, whether it's, collective bargaining for the WNBA or bundling rights together by the NCAA and therefore, potentially, not giving the opportunity for competitive bidding around like women's basketball. So I think these emerging leagues who are being, in many cases, really thoughtful on these issues of equity, I do hope that they become more of a bellwether for the rest of the industry.
Yeah, and I think it goes to what you said at the top, right? Even seeing athletes, specifically women athletes, then become investors in women's sports, in men's sports overall. So that also is a part of this new ecosystem that we're seeing. So not just providing the equity as they are actively in their careers, and even that includes NCAA players, which you also mentioned earlier. I think that's really interesting and could be a disruptive force. And yet, Sharon, I think that what we're all saying is that it's still going to take some time. So I do have a few questions here
Hold on,
that
can we just,
Oh yeah,
one
go ahead.
comment I wanted to make. I wanted to get
Sure.
Ed's from the Kaplan report. If Ed could just educate the group on the NCAA sales structure.
Mm.
It's enlightening to this conversation. and I'm hoping that change is coming.
Sure, Carol. Obviously Carol wants to be the moderator of the next panel. Anyway,
If I have to lose a job, losing it to Carol Stiff is fine.
it's more fun asking the questions. A couple of points. So the way, I think this was in the 2011, roughly. It was the deal before the current deal for the men's tournament. It was the Turner Turner CBS joint deal. Basically, what happened was Turner and CBS bought out the rights to sell NCAA sponsorship. So any NCAA sponsorship, not just March Madness, but in particular March Madness, is sold by a sales team that is a Turner CBS sales team. Now, Turner and CBS also own the television rights to the men's tournament. So, given the ability to package the sponsorship rights for the entire NCAA, given their interest in the men's tournament, how do you think they're going to structure the sponsorship deals and their go to market for those sponsorships? Well, guess what? If you want to get into the men's tournament, you have to go in through their door. You've got to buy a bunch of media in the men's tournament. So let's just say that you're an upstart, small capitalized women's targeted apparel brand or makeup brand or any other brand, and you want to get into the women's tournament. Well, guess what? You have to buy through the men's tournament. And you probably don't have enough budget to be able to do that. They want 8 figures for those deals. And so it is systemically designed. Now, I don't believe that it was systemically designed for the purpose of avoiding getting revenue onto the women's sponsorship side of the ledger. I think it was designed by the people who were writing the check to maximize their potential of getting return on that. And frankly, they're not all that interested in driving sponsorship to a women's tournament that's on ESPN when they've got the rights to the men's tournament. And so it's just structurally such that unless you rework that, unless you either force them to divvy it up. I mean, this is back to what we were saying about the rights earlier. If you're going to package it all together, then you're going to get a particular kind of outcome, like renewing a deal with ESPN only. That's what happened. Same sort of thing happens in sponsorship. And I'll make one other comment about the NCAA. And it's easy to vilify the NCAA. That's there are plenty of people set up to do that, and believe me, I am not an apologist for them at all. But I think they are becoming less and less relevant. I think we're entering an age where between the SEC and the Big Ten, I mean, that's where the power in college sports is coalescing. And there are plenty of other conferences that don't want anything to do with that, but they don't necessarily have the schools to avoid it. And so we're seeing, I think, a minimization of the impact of the NCAA. Some speculate that maybe there won't be an NCAA in the future. I don't know enough to prognosticate on that, but I think for us to expect an organization that is under fire to be particularly innovative when they're trying to hide in their bunkers, I don't know how practical that is.
I appreciate Carol, with the primary assist there, because we've alluded to bundling and how these things work, but getting that context is critically important. And so I'm going to come to you again, Carol, in just a minute. But Pam, since the NCAA, effectively the structure was brought up, I want to ask you this. So, given everything that Ed just said, where does Title IX stand in all of this? Because I think that there is a lot that we're seeing as far as what is the now and what is the future. People asking, maybe the NCAA becomes more of a business model, but it's as of now structured as a nonprofit, and Title IX then is able to operate under that guise. So is there a future for Title IX if and when the NCAA changes its structure?
Yeah, that's a great question. And everything that Ed said in his most recent comment, I agree with. It is
Not the other ones.
not necessarily all the other ones.
That's okay.
Some of the
I'm
other,
a big boy.
but the most recent one, yes. Yeah, it's a real conflict of interest. Why is CBS Turner going to go out of its way to get sponsors for ESPN? And the impact is that then ESPN can negotiate for lower priced rights because it doesn't have the ability to sell sponsorships. And so then there's less money coming in from the women's tournament. And then the NCAA will say, oh, these tournaments lose money for us. Well, it's because of all these reasons. It isn't because of lack of fan interest. But getting back to the question about Title IX, there was a Supreme Court case a couple decades ago, I think in the 90s, that said that Title IX does not apply to the NCAA because they are not getting federal funding. There are many legal scholars who believe that there could be grounds for getting Title IX to apply. I think we're seeing right now, depending on what happens with the settlement, some threats to Title IX. If you can pay all these male players so much more than female players, and if you start spending a lot more operationally on male sports than female sports, that's a real issue. But at the same time, we're seeing that in a few cases where colleges have recently cut sports. Concordia University did that. Stephen Austin did that. And they set themselves up for Title IX lawsuits because the very surprising truth is that less than 10% of all NCAA colleges are in compliance with Title IX. It sounds crazy, right? It is crazy. 50 years in, and only 10%, if that, are in compliance. So when these schools cut a women's program, that sets themselves up for a lawsuit, and then they may need to add more women's teams as a result of that. And a quick plug for the gender equity dashboard. If you go to accelerateequity.net, and to our dashboard, you can pop in the name of any college or university, and you can see how they're doing in terms of giving women proportional opportunity, athletic aid, and how that college splits up its spending on men's and women's sports. So I think it's a very challenging time right now for Title IX. When Title IX was first passed, people said this will be the death of football. Oh my God, we can't do this. It's going to kill football. Of course, football has survived very nicely. And so I would like to see the settlement overturned. I would like people to recognize that these payments are similar to financial aid, and they should be split proportionally to the number of male and female athletes at any college.
Yeah. And again, just from my purview, raised by a lawyer, but never went to law school, just as a caveat. But I mean, again, the NCAA and how it has operated versus maybe this new wild, wild west. I think it makes for a very murky time when it comes to incorporating NIL, of course, the upward tick of broadcast and media rights, but the athletes themselves are the ones that are kind of caught here. I do have two questions, at least two, that I want to get to more if we have time, from Darlene and Peyton. Darlene's question, I think I would like to have Ed have the first crack. For Peyton's question, I'd like to come to Sharon. However, Carol, I want to also ask you, as you're hearing all of this and are a part of this conversation, how does what we've talked about today impact what you're doing in real time for women's sports as a part of the Women's Sports Network? Because we've talked about a lot of the barriers, and I get the sense in having conversations with you over the years that your network is trying to buck the trend here, and maybe a la what we've talked about with Ally, try to find new models for women's sports in particular.
Well, thanks for allowing me to talk about the Women's Sports Network. We're in our fourth year, can't believe it. But it allows a few things. One is some live programming that's not getting picked up by the major linear networks. I think Sharon, you mentioned that we have had the rugby, we had League One volleyball, we've had the Professional Hockey League. It's funny that we had a few of those 1 year in, and then they got a better offer the following year, which means to me we're doing our job. It also allows us to do a studio, like a Sports Center show. Our studio is called Game On, which is all highlights of women's sports. And the last thing I love about the Women's Sports Network is we can storytell. And getting to some of Pam's remarks, no one's doing storytelling. No one hears the story before you watch the game. Most of the main networks that have been mentioned today go from one live event to the next, and they don't let it breathe. And so we have the opportunity and the platform to storytell. And then also, lastly, keep this season alive for 365 days of the year. So when the NWSL finishes up this weekend, why can't we be doing more stories about the players and where they play and the Brazilians and then, with the NCAA, talking to the lacrosse coaches yesterday, they said, you mean we can put our games on your network? I go, absolutely. I'll think of us as a catcher behind home plate. We'll catch the feed and get it out to every single home in the nation. We're on every major tier, from connected TVs like Samsung and Roku and Vizio, and then the Tubies and the Freebies and the Fubos. So there's an opportunity for more women's sports to be seen. What we're missing are the allies. We're missing advertisers. Advertisers are still not spending at our level. Of course, they're spending at the ESPN level, which is terrific to see, but we'd love to take in some advertisers so we can produce quality, great storytelling, which needs to be done. So thanks for that plug, Erica.
Oh, no problem. Love the work that you're doing, as always. Have two questions from our Q&A that I want to get to. Darlene, and again, Ed, I'll have you address this one. Just for the sake of time, I'll direct these two questions. But Darlene asking, can you talk about how the settlement will also impact Division II and Division III athletes? And is there any differentiation that we see with how the settlement impacts sports at that level?
Well, the House case did not name as plaintiffs Division II, Division III athletes. I think I believe there was a class that if you had an NIL deal at the time, there was a particular carve out. But for the most part, Division II and III were just not part of this. And in fairness, they're not big revenue drivers, and you can't get money from a stone. So I think that's the short answer.
Yeah, definitely some things outside of the purview of this conversation that impact that for sure. Thank you, Ed, and thank you for the question from Darlene. Peyton has a question, and Sharon, I want to have you take a go at this. What actions do you think the NCAA needs to take between now and its next media deal to demonstrate that it's seriously focused on the growth of women's sports? Now, I know that you have a lot of experience on the pro side of things, and so I'm asking you maybe to utilize that lens and also the emerging media lens to perhaps forward think for the NCAA here, Sharon.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think ratings are always important, and clearly, the women's basketball tournament has proved that it can garner the eyeballs. That's always one of the best stories. If you're going out to market and trying to renew a deal, having good ratings is just about like talking point number one to get discussions going. I think we've all alluded to it when we've talked about bundling and competitive bidding, right? There's a lack of competitive bidding here. And, the NCAA can decide whether, they want to do more like an NWSL model where they've got so many different broadcast outlets. And, one can argue that that is good for monetization. It makes it really challenging for fans to find your content. To Carol's point earlier about sort of ESPN, like, can you get the same amount of sort of synergies and cross promotion and shoulder programming if you have to push people across networks or platforms? But clearly just the idea of competitive bidding itself, even if you end up with a single distribution partner, is an important part of the process. And we've all alluded to this bundling and the tension between potentially what is helpful with bundling. I would argue the WNBA has probably gotten juicier media rights deals because they are, bundled with the NBA. The NWSL has been doing great. I mean, multiples are growing up, but those are really low bases, right? So there is this fundamental tension. But I think if you don't put it out for competitive bidding and you don't let the market tell you, like, I think the biggest problem with the NCAA is they're not actually getting market intelligence because they're not going through the process. And again, if you've got like indicators like ratings, like sponsor dollars flowing in, it becomes an easier story to tell when you're out, for the next media rights deal to get a bigger dollar valuation, and also one that is specific to the women's sports.
Thank you, Sharon. We have a question here from Judith. I think we can squeeze in. Pam, I'd like you to take this one on. Judith asking, how do we get beyond a historical bias towards men's sports with them having such, a longer on-ramp thinking about NCAA? If we think about that head start and where we are now, to use a Fat Joe pun, yesterday's price is not today's price, but only if the people in power see the value. So what would you say as ways to break down some of that bias that exists because men's sports are familiar and have been for longer?
Yeah, I think, part of this goes back to something that I believe Ed said earlier, that when you look at the demographics of fans of women's sports and fans of men's sports, there is a lot of crossover. I think what has been key toward getting more enthusiasm and eyeballs on women's sports has been social media and streaming, right? We're no longer competing for the very limited spots on linear television. And so networks like Carol's that are creating even more opportunity for women's sports to be seen. That's tremendous, because for so long, just finding a women's game on television was, either it didn't exist or it was extremely difficult. And, you certainly wouldn't get some advertisement letting you know that tomorrow the game would be on. So I think the more visibility there is, the game sells itself. The product has been great for a long time. It just has been kind of hidden back in a dark corner. And then on social media, athletes are telling their own stories. There's also been research that shows that women athletes are seen as very trustworthy in terms of the products that they endorse. So I think it's visibility begets visibility.
Well, all the more reason that we appreciate all of you, Pam, Sharon, Ed, Carol, joining us here to have this conversation. And we did want to have it free flowing. There's so much expertise on this panel, and I'm grateful to have learned from you all. But thank you also for those who were able to chime in. We had a lot more questions than we were able to get to, but we thank you so much for joining us today. Attendees, again, we appreciate all of your questions. Everyone, thank you for joining us. And I will turn it over as we are done with the conversation portion of today's event.